History is told by the victors. This is a common turn of phrase that is, for better or for worse, true, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. For most of their history, the human race passed on their stories through oral tradition, telling stories to their children who told stories to theirs, until it was finally written down. In this day and age, where we have so many stories available to us, we often don't think to ask our family and friends for theirs, which, unbeknownst to our knowledge, might be incredibly interesting. The retelling of these personal stories helps keep a human face on history, and helps it from becoming just another dry history lesson in high school. I was inspired to do this with my own family, and so I asked some of them for their stories, and I was not disappointed. I got funny stories, I got interesting stories, and I didn't get any sad stories, but there were definitely some that were more thought-provoking than others. I hope to share with you a few of my favorites that I gathered over the past month, and I hope to inspire you to do the same with your family, to find out what they have experienced. I'll start with one of my grandfathers. To set the scene a bit, it's 1964, in Namibia.
I was hired by a company that was going to Southwest Africa, as it was called at the time, because it had been a German protectorate for many, many years. But I got a job and they sent me overseas to be part of what they called a magnetometer survey. And a magnetometer survey was just another way of looking at geological structures underground that you couldn't see, but you could make deductions about them based on how the magnetic field was changed when different strata of rocks and that sort of thing. And I arrived, and very shortly after we got there, we were going to drive to several hundred miles outside the capital of Windhoek, which is where we were headquartered. And there were, 10 or 12 of us on the crew, something like that. And we had all of these Jeeps because we were doing surveys. And so we were driving Jeeps, and we drove for hours and hours. And I was getting tired, and these were over really bumpy, dusty roads, and I had been wearing contact lenses for a short time, and my eyes were burning, and I was tired, and it started to get dark, and after a while it got quite dark, and after a while I noticed that my lights we were in we were following each other. So I wasn't doing this by map, but I was just following along with some others. And my lights got dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until I could hardly see. And I'd never driven this particular vehicle before, so I knew nothing about it. I just knew that I couldn't see anymore. And at some point, the lights went out entirely, and the Jeep stopped running. And for reasons that I don't fully understand, the rest of the caravan kept on going. And I was sitting in the middle of Southwest Africa late at night. It was very dark, and I didn't have any idea where I was. We weren't in a town. There weren't any towns. We hadn't seen any towns since we left the capital. And I sat there, and a dog started barking and scared me to death. And about a half an hour later, finally somebody realized that young college kid who was supposed to be there helping them was not there. So they drove back to look for me, and they found me, and they put me in another Jeep and drove me to the camp. And I worked there we were there for 9 months in a great big, it was called a pan, the Etosha Pan, which is, if you look on a map, you'll see that as a geological feature. And it's just a huge mud flat. And they were doing a magnetometer survey there, and I'm told that the reason they were doing it was because they were trying to find salt domes, because salt domes were a good place that you could store oil. And after that, we couldn't work anymore because it was the rainy season, and you can't work during the rainy season on a mud flat. So they sent me to Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi Arabia, they were also doing magnetometer surveys, but they were doing them in the Red Sea. So I worked in the office for a while, just doing calculations and stuff that they use so that they can put things on maps and try to figure out the stuff that they figure out when they're looking for oil. And after a while, they decided that they would put me on one of the ships. So they put me on, and it was a small, I mean, it was, I don't know, a 70, 80 foot ship or something like that, but it wasn't, you know, a giant. And my job was to sit at a map, and they would take readings so that we would know every few minutes where we were, so that we could plot precisely on a map where we were in the Red Sea. And that was important because that was how you could then transfer this information to a paper map, and they would have a way of looking at where these underwater structures were that they were looking for. And I did that for, I don't know, probably about a week, something like that. And the way it worked is that it was a triangulation process. So if you think about the ship being here in the Red Sea and a radio transmitting a location over here, and then another radio transmitting location over here, both transmitting to the ship, you'd have constant triangulation, and we had instruments that would read us and that would read out, and it was my job to read the instruments, and they'd shoot off a charge or they'd take a reading, and I had to spot where the reading was by looking at these instruments. They were having problems with one of the radio transmitting stations, which was on a tiny little rock island in what was called the Farasan Island Group. And again, if you look on a map, you can see this little cluster of islands. And they had problems because the transmitter kept going out. And as soon as the transmitter would go out, it would create a huge problem because you could no longer triangulate. So it didn't do them any good to take readings because they didn't know where the readings were. So they said to me, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put you off on this little island, and your job will be to change the oil in the generator. And that had to be done every 24, 48 hours, something like that. I had a college degree and 2.5 years of graduate work in philosophy, and my job was to change the oil in a generator every 48 hours. And the rest of the time I didn't have anything to do.
You had a typewriter.
Hmm?
You had a typewriter.
I had a typewriter, and I was working on a novel at the time. And so I said, okay, well, if that's what you want me to do is go on that island. They said, now we're going to leave you there for 2 weeks. And there was nobody on the island. So it wasn't like they put me off at a little resort area. There was nobody on the island except me, except there was no vegetation. It was like Saudi Arabia. It was just it was flat. There was no there weren't trees on it. There was no vegetation. There was rocks and sand. So they said, and you'll need to go down and to the ship's supply of food and get yourself 2 weeks worth of food. I didn't have any idea what 2 weeks worth of food looked like. And I went down, and they had cans of stuff and some crackers and some peanut butter, and I didn't know, so I just picked out some stuff. And nobody was giving me any help about how to figure out how to do this. And a very nice man came up to me, and he said, I understand they're putting you on the island. And I said, yes. And he said, do you have a gun? I said, no. And he said, I wish you had a gun. He said, you don't know who's going to stop off at that island and decide that you have something that they want. And I said, well, I don't. I didn't take him too seriously because I'd never carried a gun, even though I was from Texas. And then he asked me if I knew anything about the radio transmitter. And I said, no. And he said, well, the thing you need to know is that you never touch it, because if you touch it, you could get a terrible, terrible burn. Not from the heat, but just from the electricity flowing through there. Nobody else had bothered to tell me that, and he wasn't my boss. I mean, he was just a guy who, he was a consultant, he was on the ship, and he was being kind and looking after me. And I was always very grateful because nobody else was. They just told me, go get my food, get off, you'll be there for 2 weeks. So I got there, and the first night I was sleeping in the tent, and I had a hammock, and I had a net over the hammock so that the mosquitoes couldn't get to me. And I felt something stirring at my feet, and I got a flashlight, and there was a rat in bed with me, and there was a free-for-all to see who could get out of the bed first, me or the rat. And I think I won by a narrow margin. So the next day I thought, well, I'll go explore the island, and the island was about 3 miles long and about 3/4 of a mile wide. That was the size of the island, no vegetation. So I went down, and I thought, well, this is not going to be so bad because I can go down. And I waded out, and it was kind of, the water was nice, and I thought, okay, good. I come down here and swim, and then I'll go back to the tent, and I'll work at my typewriter for a while, and I'll have lots of time to sit and think and be by myself. And I didn't mind that. That was fine. So I quit sleeping in the tent because I didn't like the idea of the rats sleeping with me. And so the next day I woke up, and I thought, well, I'll just go down to the beach. And I went down to the beach, and the water was a completely different color. It had been a beautiful blue, little sort of waves lapping in the day before, and now the water was black. And I realized that the reason it was black was that there was a school of little tiny fish, and they were so dense that it made the water look black. And I thought, oh, well, that's okay, sardines aren't going to eat me. So I walked out, and all of a sudden everything just exploded, and the fish started jumping out of the water, and there were seagulls overhead, and they were swooping down, and as the fish would jump up out of the water, they'd grab them up and they'd fly off. And I started hearing these other sounds, and I realized that the sounds that I was hearing were shark jaws, because they were eating the fish and making sounds with the big sharky jaws. And that was kind of scary. So I got out of the water and I thought, okay, I don't need to worry about this because I'll only go in up to my knees and they won't swim in the water. And I'm standing there up to my knees, and I see a fin out of the water, and it's coming straight at me. So I back up, and I get out of the water and think, okay, I'm safe now. And the shark actually swam up on the beach and was lying there flopping around. And he had to wait for a little wave to come in for him to get back in the water. So I realized I wasn't even safe, even up to my ankles, because these sharks would come in that close to shore. So that was the end of my ability to go to the seashore and enjoy myself. So I was there for 2 weeks, and toward the end of 2 weeks, I had basically run out of food, and what I had was peanut butter and crackers. So I'd have peanut butter and crackers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it was funny because being there all by myself, I kind of lost my appetite, and it wasn't fun anymore. And I waited a day, and nobody came to get me. And I waited another day, and nobody came to get me. And about the 3rd or 4th day, I decided this is ridiculous. Now, it was set up so that I had radio transmission abilities to the ship, which was at least 200 miles away. So if I'd, called up and said I'm in trouble, it would have been a minimum of 10 hours for the ship to get to me, because these were big, slow ships. So I called up the ship to say, please come get me, except I couldn't get them. So I did that for about 3 days, and every few hours I'd get on the radio and try to reach the ship, and nobody would get me. And finally, it was close to a week after they were supposed to come and get me, and I finally contacted them. And the story they told me was that there were actually two ships that were together. One ship was a little faster than the other, and they had gone into port to get more provisions, and then they were going to return to the site in the Red Sea. And they were out of radio range for part of the time. And what they decided to do was take the fast ship and tie it by rope to the slower ship so that the fast ship could tow the slower ship and they could get there a little bit faster. And that worked fine until the fast ship went on a reef. And of course what happened was the slow ship kept right on coming up and jammed in next to the ship that was on the reef. Now we had two ships on the reef, and they were starting to have a storm, and there were high waves, and the waves were coming along and picking the ship up and then dropping it down on this reef. These are grown men who were supposed to know what they were doing. So they said to me, get on your radio and see if you can, there may be ships coming by somewhere and help us, because we've got to get off these ships. So I got on the radio, and I think it was for about 12, 16, 18 hours straight. I was on the radio, and it was like a movie, and I was there saying, Mayday, Mayday, we have an emergency. And finally, after a long time, I got an answer from a ship that turned out to be a passenger ship that had come through the Suez Canal and was on its way down to the port of Aden, which is on the tip of Saudi Arabia on that peninsula. And I talked with someone and told them what had happened, and they said, okay, well, we will swing by and see what we can do to help them. So they went out of their way and took everyone off the ship except for the captain of the ship and the head of the guy that was the head of the crew that was running the geophysical survey. And the reason they stayed with it is because the maritime law said that if someone finds an abandoned ship at sea, they can tow it back to port. They own that ship. Well, the ship itself was probably worth $1 million, and there was probably $1 million worth of geophysical equipment on the ship. So they weren't willing to just leave all of that stuff in the middle of the sea. And so then they had to, once they got it straightened out, most of the crew sailed back to the port of Aden. They didn't come get me. I'm still on the island. And they helped get a tugboat out to the site. And the tugboat was there, and it was a very complicated operation to be able to get some sort of way of dislodging the boats there. And it took them 3 or 4 days. So by the time they finally got the ship off of the reef, I'd been on the island for the 2 weeks that I was supposed to be there, and for 2 more weeks that I wasn't supposed to be there. Meanwhile, the crew was off in all sorts of different places, and finally they got in touch with me and said, well, okay, we're going to come get you. It'll be about 3 days before we can get to you. And they finally got to me 3 days later, and I've been on the island for about a month by myself. And I was glad to get off the island, and I hoped I never saw it again.
It's really interesting to think about what actually led to this, what historical significance this has. You can trace it back to before World War I for the scramble of Africa, when Germany colonized Namibia, Southwest Africa. You can trace it back to World War I, when Germany lost that colony, and when the advent of oil came around for ships, creating this driving need for oil in all the economies of the major world powers. All of this led up to this story. And this story will have future significance for oil, the economy. It's really interesting to think about. Next, I'd like to show you a story from my grandmother. To set the scene a little bit, my grandmother's parents traveled a lot. Her father was a geologist that may have been a CIA agent and spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union and Cold War Europe. And her mother was an opera singer. But because of this travel, her childhood was disrupted. She was moved to Switzerland in high school, and her German teacher from LA, where she used to live, invited her to come to Austria for a year.
But anyway, so we'd had adventures like that, and when I was 7, we had gone over to Europe for 4 months, and Mom was taking lessons, voice lessons, and Dad, we traveled together for a while, and then Dad went to Africa to do some geological work and left Mom and my brother and me in a pension in Florence, where we were for probably 5 weeks, and I would walk every day with my mother. I was 7, up to her voice teacher on the other side of Florence, and sit there and listen to her practice and sing and get instruction from Signor Guerrieri for about 3 to 4 hours. So then we would walk back, and we stayed in this lovely place that was run by a woman named Signora Zimi, and she just spoiled us. Every morning she'd bring us hot chocolate, and we had a little balcony off our room. So I had a lot of experiences in Europe, and when I was a junior in high school, my teacher for German came over on a Fulbright scholarship from Austria, and he was a really interesting guy, and he had a wife and a couple of children, and they lived in Palo Alto, California, where I grew up. And so he, at the end of the year, he asked me if I'd be interested in coming over as an exchange student to Graz, Austria, which is where he taught. And I was pretty excited about that. Anyway, so we were going to go to Europe, and we were going to youth hostel, and then Dad got this Fulbright scholarship that brought him to Zurich, Switzerland with all of us, and he was going to be there for a year. I did end up in Zurich, and knowing that I was going to go to Zurich, I talked to my professor, my German professor, Professor Panholzer, and he said, you know, I could arrange to have you come and go to school in Austria, where I live, and he said you would go to the school that I teach at, and it was a high school, and I said, well, that sounded good, and that's what we did. And at Christmas time, I left Zurich and went and took the train to Graz, Austria. And I had, meanwhile, that previous summer, I started a friendship with a pen pal who was a student in Professor Panholzer's school. And her name was Brigitte Poyer. And she and I corresponded, and we decided that summer, that first summer that I was there living in Zurich with my parents, I would take a train and meet her, and we would youth hostel for 6 weeks in Austria and in Italy. And so we did that, and it was pretty successful. We had a good time, ran out of money, but found ways to, we ended up traveling at night instead of staying in a youth hostel because we couldn't afford the youth hostel, but we could sleep on the train. And she and I became good friends. And so her mother invited me to live with them for that year that I was in Austria. And the year was very interesting. It was not all good. I made a lot of friends, and we had a great time, and my friend Brigitte was okay to live with, and her mother was weird. And at one point, her mother decided on it was a February night, and it was freezing cold, and I had come back with some friends, and I couldn't get in my room. And my room was right outside their apartment, and I had a key to just this one separate room, which their apartment was so small that I had to stay in that particular room, which is right next to the apartment. And I tried my key, and I couldn't get into my room. And so one thing led to another, and I moved out of that room finally. I connected with my professor, and I moved in with him and his family for a couple of weeks. And then another young woman in my class came and asked me if would I like to live with her family. And I said sure, and that worked out fine. The interesting thing was that Brigitte's mother was a single mother. Her husband had been killed in the war. Elfie's mother was married to a man who was in the war, and the last she had heard of him was that he was a prisoner in Russia, and he never did get out. And I became aware that my friends, another one called Trixie and another one called Taxi, they had no fathers. And it sort of dawned on me that the reason they had no fathers was that they were killed in the war. But it wasn't until many years later that I put two and two together and thought that had to have affected them all. And I was the American that came from what they considered to be a rich country. And it explained a lot of things, because it turned out that during that year, not everybody was kind to me. And in fact, they did some things, like the woman who locked me out of my room with everything I had was in that room, and she wasn't going to let me back into my room. And in the end, she stole a ring from me that my grandfather had given me that was my grandmother's, that had an emerald in it, and it was very dear to me. It was not worth a ton of money, but she went through my room and she stole things. And at school, people were nice to me mostly, but they never wanted to have a close friendship. And so it was years later that I figured out that they saw me as the rich American who was coming into their lives and wanting me to be their friends. But it was the people that I knew growing up in America and the men that went off to war and killed their husbands. So the reason that they were not particularly welcoming to me was because they were single mothers raising children and never probably ever going to see their husbands again because they were killed in the war. And all of a sudden I understood why I had kind of a mixed welcome. There were some people that were nice to me, and Ponholzer was always nice to me, and his wife and his two children, and I spent a fair amount of time with them. Ponholzer's wife, just as an aside story, was a wealthy woman and had lived in a huge house in Graz in Austria. And I found out while I was there that the Germans took over the house, and there was a prisoner where they kept Americans in the basement. And it was kind of surreal, because then after the war, she got her house back, and it was a beautiful big house. But knowing that in the basement there had been a prison, and there probably were lots of horrible things that took place there. So it was an interesting time. A few years later, when I was a sophomore in college, junior in college, I went to Germany, and I lived there for the summer and worked in Heidelberg at the university, and again made a good friend that I worked with. And the same story. Her mother was a widow from the war, and she and I and her husband spent a fair amount of time together, and we had some very interesting discussions where some of that anger still came out at me. I remember one night we started talking about the war, and we were in Vietnam at that point, and they were telling me that Americans shouldn't be in Vietnam, that it was bad what they were doing. I didn't disagree actually at the time, but they all of a sudden it was very personally directed at me, as though I had something to do with the fact that Americans were in Vietnam. And she and her husband got really exercised, and I'm there trying to defend my position in German, and I'm thinking, they don't want me to defend my position. They have anger at me. So that same anger that I was a victim of when I was in high school was still there 4 years later when I went back and went to Germany, that time, not Austria. So that was an interesting time. I didn't understand what was taking place while I was there, and why there were certain things that were done to me that were unkind. But I now understand that I was in a foreign land, and people looked at me as very much a foreigner, and connected to that. They felt that I was rich because I lived in America. They were not rich. They were struggling, many of them. My friend Elfie, who I lived with the second time after I left the other place, her mother worked as a seamstress, and they all had kind of menial jobs. And in the apartment that I lived in and that Elfie and her mother lived in, the bathroom was down the hall, the public bathroom. That's what we used. And the kitchen had 2 big tubs in it for hot water and cold water. And there was a bathtub in the kitchen with a curtain that you could pull around it in order to take a shower or to take a bath. And she didn't have a refrigerator, so anything that needed refrigeration, it was wintertime, we put it out on the windowsill so that it would stay cold. So it was very different, and that was the early 60s, very early 60s. In fact, no, it was the end of the 50s, 58. So it wasn't all that long after the war. For me, it seemed like a long time because I was born at the end of the war. So I didn't know anything about the war from the experience.
Quick additional story. When I was in Southwest Africa, I got in a conversation with a man who was German, and he learned that I was from the United States and from Texas, and he said, I love the United States. He said, that was the best time of my life. He said, the people are so friendly and it's such a beautiful country. And I said, well, when were you there? And he said, it would have been 45, 46, something like that. And I realized he's talking about either during the war or directly after. And I said, what were you doing in the United States at that time? And he said, I was a prisoner of war.
It's really interesting to consider that even though in American history lessons and textbooks and many European textbooks were seen as sort of liberators in World War II, that many of the people who suffered through the war didn't necessarily see us that way. If you consider the residents of Dresden having their entire city destroyed by American and British bombs must have been out of this world. And to be able to feel, see an experience of this anger towards Americans, British, French come out, especially my grandmother, is just really interesting to think about. The next story I want to show you is of my sister. She got her graduate degree in ecological sciences and is working with trying to preserve the world we have, especially water, be it water sources, environments, everything. But to set the scene, this is Cameroon, about 2017.
Okay, so let's see, Cameroon. So I went to Cameroon in January 2016, and I was there for a service trip with my college. And before going to Cameroon, we kind of did a lot of research, but we just had a lot of group meetings, and our group was about 12 people on what to expect going into a different culture and just learning about African culture as a whole and Cameroonian culture more specifically. And so when we got there, we landed in the capital of the country. I can't remember what it's called now, but we spent a little bit of time, it's been so long, spent some time in the capital, and we were at Dickinson had a study abroad program there, and so they had a university kind of dorm situation that wasn't really a dorm but more of a large house. And so our group stayed there for the first couple of days, and that was really city living and kind of the picture that at least that I imagine of being in a really crowded, populated, third world city. It really matched that vision in my head, and it was very smoggy, lots of pollution, lots of people constantly moving, lots of traffic, and unorganized, chaotic traffic where I don't even remember if there were traffic lights, but just I remember people trying to swerve and get around each other. And so that was kind of the scene. And the house that we were in, I remember fluorescent lighting because there's different access to resources over there. So electricity is one of them, water is another one that people know about. And I remember there were some rules around how we were able to bathe and shower. And I think maybe it was limited to maybe one rinse a day, and it was a 3-minute cold shower. And I don't even think that we had access to hot water. And if we wanted hot water for tea or something, we would have to boil it. And after a couple of days there, then we went over to a smaller town, smaller city. And so that was I think it was a 12-hour. And again, I don't remember the name, but I can look back and find the name. Oh, it was called Boya, UEA. I believe, Boya, Cameroon. And what did we do there? So the bus to get there was 12 hours, super crowded, very hot, no wind or no fans, no air conditioning. So it was just sweaty on the bus. And that was just a long drive, but it was cool driving through the country and leaving the city and getting to a more rural area and seeing that shift. And so Cameroon is French, English, and I guess French is one of their national languages. And so part of that is from the colonization that happened in, I want to say, the late 1800s, but you probably know better than I do. And there's literally a border. So not a border, but a bridge where you are driving on one side and everything is English speaking. And then you cross the bridge and everything is French speaking. And the road signs change, all of the signage that you see on the side of the highway changes from English to French. And so we entered in, I guess we were leaving the French speaking portion and going into the English speaking portion as we got into this smaller town. And we stopped at a gas station to grab snacks at one point. And being a group of, I think in our group of 12, I would say our diversity mix was we probably had 8 white people, 2 black people, and 2 Asian people. So we had the large crew of white people, which really stands out in a country of mostly black Africans. And so stopping at that gas station, I remember people could see us in the bus through the window, and I think the assumption was that they saw a group of white people that maybe had money, and so they crowded the bus and they were knocking on the windows and asking for money. And it was a pretty big crowd to the point where our bus driver had to push them back and have them give us some space. And so we finally get to Boya, which is our destination, and there we were staying in a guest house. So the reason we were there was a service trip, and we were working at a school to help update their infrastructure and just make the school more sound and help give them more resources. Many kids didn't bring lunch to school, and so they would provide kind of lunch there, but they only had like one big pot that they would mix up some kind of soup or stew every day. And so we like helped them build the kitchen so that they would be able to provide more food or make it easier to make food. And so the owner of that school, or not the owner of the school, there's a nonprofit that kind of runs these schools. There's an African nonprofit called United Action for Children, I believe, UAC. And so this nonprofit has this guest house for any travelers who come to volunteer and help. So that's where we were staying, and it was different from the city in that we weren't surrounded by the traffic and the noise and the people quite in the same way, and it definitely felt like we were in like a very rural village in a way. So I remember seeing people walk around like carrying huge buckets on their heads to transport goods to the market or carrying water to and from their home, and it was very friendly in a way that the city, sorry, that one was on, very friendly in a way that the city felt a little bit more overwhelming. Is that wind too loud?
It's fine.
And so one of the life in the village for those people is really daily tasks and daily survival, whereas most adults here wake up and go to their job and then they come home and they make dinner. A lot of the lifestyle for many people in that village, and I think true of many villages, is just get the food and the water that you need to eat for the day. And so as part of getting water, there's a couple of wells in each village, and people would go wait in line for their water. They would grab their bucket of water, pay for their water, and then take it home. And I think it's really easy to, in America we pay for water as well, but we don't think of it in the same way because we have water companies, and the water company provides the water through a pipe and it comes out the sink, and then at the end of the month we pay for however much water we use. And it's very distant, but there in Cameroon it was very literal. You get your bucket of water and you pay for your bucket of water. And that was something I had never really seen before. And so we also had to go grab our water because we were living that same lifestyle. And there was 3 wells in the village that people could go around to. And then on this one particular day that we were going to gather water, there were only two of the wells were down or broken. There was an issue with them. And I don't know exactly what it was, but for whatever reason, everyone still had to get their water. So they all are congregating around this one. There was a huge long line. It was super backed up, and so people were waiting for 3 hours or more in the hot sun to get their water. And we were part of that line. And at one point, I think it was me and maybe 2 others. I wasn't with my entire group of people. We were all lined up, and imagine like a dusty, wide road, and there was a plantation nearby with banana trees, maybe? Yeah, I want to say like a banana tree plantation, really big, wide, dusty road. Everything is brown and red, and some ramshackle like huts and houses as we're waiting, and then a couple of nicer built-up houses. And when I say nicer, what I really means like having 4 walls and a roof that is made of material as opposed to ramshackles together. And in one of those houses, I remember they had a big driveway, and there was just a man and woman, I assume husband and wife, that were just standing there watching of people waiting for water. And they saw us, white people, stand out of the crowd, and their assumption was these people are not from here, these people probably don't belong here. And so they approached us and they said, "We have a private, would you like some water?" And we were confused and didn't really know what that meant. And what it means is that they had their own private, whereas most of the village would have to go between these 3 public wells. Those who had enough money were able to install their own well, because when you think about where the water comes from, it's just underground. So it's a matter of digging the well and having the materials that you need to maintain it and to be able to then access that water safely, where it's not coming up with dirt or any other harmful chemicals. So they had that, and they offered us to use their well, and we accepted. And so they invited us into their kind of backyard, area, and we pulled up our water and we said thank you, and then we went our separate ways. So that is the story of the water, and it was definitely an interesting experience looking back on it, because I think about the reason why they approached us, and in my head, I'll never know for sure, but in my head, it's because they saw us as others, they saw us as different, and perhaps it's also that they had a stereotype of us being white and therefore having some amount of money that the rest of the village didn't have, and for whatever reason, that was a reason for them to approach us and offer us water. So in our situation, it was very kind and very helpful, but also to think about how does that impact the lives of others who don't receive that treatment, of people who are living their day to day and who do have to wait in that line frequently, or every time that there's a backup, that impacts your entire day. If you have to go wait for water for 3 hours, you're able to go do the other things that you might have to do. And so thinking about those people that do have access to private wells, that they could offer that water to anybody and they choose not to. And in that story, they chose us as the people to offer water to. But interesting to think about, as water is a growing crisis of having access and having safe drinking water. And unfortunately, in the places where it's driest, like many parts of Africa, is the places where there's also the least amount of wealth and the least amount of ability to get the infrastructure you need to get wells or whatever other things it might be.
I really don't have much else to say about this. It's interesting getting this perspective, this first-hand perspective on the sort of situation that's going on in Africa. You may remember a few years back, there was that huge water crisis in Cape Town, in South Africa. And kind of getting a first-hand view of it, even though it's not the full story of this situation, we're not getting the perspective of the native Cameroonians here, it's still incredibly interesting to see, and to see how their past as a colony of Germany, then France, and their exploitation has completely affected their ability to provide for their people and themselves. I'd like to show you one or two more stories. This next one is a short one from my grandmother.
About my aunt taking me to Normandy when I was 14. It was right before my 15th birthday, and it was my 15th birthday present, and we went to Rouen, the capital city, for a few days, and we stayed at this hotel that was right on the main square, and it was hot and all the windows were open, and that's when I learned how late the French stay up and they don't start dinner until 10 o'clock. But at one side of the square was the big cathedral, and it had scaffolding on the outside, and I asked, what are they doing to the cathedral? And she said, well, they were repairing the bomb damage. And this was 1976. And I said, bomb damage? You've brought me to a place where they bomb things? And she said, no, the damage is from World War II. World War II? What have they been doing ever since the war? They've been repairing the inside of the cathedral. And we went inside and we saw those massive pillars that are all curved, and sure enough, they had spent years making pieces so they could rebuild the inside of the cathedral.
The next story I'd like to share with you is from my mother, and I'll let her explain it herself.
When I was a senior in high school, I went on a trip to Russia with my history teacher, and this was a particularly interesting time to be going to Russia because it was actually the Soviet Union. It was 1987, and it was at the beginning of Glasnost.
Glasnost being the Soviet program of government transparency and really the start and thaw of the Soviet Union.
And so it was very exciting to be able to go to places like Leningrad, which was still Leningrad, and Moscow. And they, in addition to bringing the high school kids on the trip, they also allowed adults to come. So my mom happened to be on the same trip. So we got to Moscow, and in addition to seeing all the sights and visiting Lenin's tomb and all the other places, I was particularly excited to be there because my mother and I had the opportunity to have dinner with somebody there who my grandparents had known for many years. Now, to back up a little bit, my grandfather in the 1960s had spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, technically as a science advisor for the US government. We don't actually know what he was doing, but that's the story that he shared with us. And while he was there, he met a young boy named Vladimir who was 13 years old but happened to know English, and so they became friendly because Vladimir worked as my grandfather's translator over the many trips that my grandfather took to the Soviet Union. And so my grandfather and my grandmother, who accompanied him on those trips, became very close with this boy and exchanged letters and always got together when my grandparents went to the Soviet Union. So when we got to Moscow, we had Vladimir's phone number, but we also knew that getting together with him for dinner was not going to be super easy because it was possible that we were going to put him at risk for him meeting with Westerners without specific government permission. But so the next kind of part of the story sort of feels like a little bit of a spy movie, because what we ended up doing was calling him from a payphone, and at that point he let us know that we should meet him at Dom Knigi, which was a huge bookstore in the center of Moscow. We met him there, and there he was in a trench coat, just like in a spy movie, and he led us around the corner to his tiny little car and drove us to his apartment. And it really looked like one of these classic Soviet block-style apartments that you see in the movies. He had 3 rooms, which they shared with his wife and his child and the in-laws, and they were packed in there. And this was actually considered to be a very nice apartment because he was pretty high up in the Communist Party and worked for a publisher. But anyway, we get there, and they were so excited to see us. They opened their home. They were so welcoming. We had this delicious kind of classic Russian meal. And even though they didn't speak Russian, and they didn't speak English, and we didn't speak Russian, Vladimir provided the translations, and we all got along very well. And then at the end of the meal, this amazing thing happened. He opened up this cabinet in the dining room and took out this box that was probably 8 by 10 inches, and opened it up and took out all of these cards, and they were the Christmas cards that my grandparents had sent him starting in 1962 all the way to 1987. And my grandparents, like so many people, would send out a Christmas card, photographs of every single one of their children and grandchildren, and a letter detailing what all of us had been up to that year. And he turned to us, and of course this was the first time my mother and I had met him, and he looked at me and he said, "I've watched you grow up." And it was actually a pretty cool experience to see. It was actually a really cool experience to have this personal connection with somebody over thousands of miles and lots of decades. And it really was a memorable moment for me in that trip.
I don't have much to say, apart from I'm so glad I did this. I learned a lot about my family, a lot about our past, and it was incredibly interesting. I had got so many stories, many of which I didn't use here. And it's incredibly interesting to tie these stories back to the past to see where their historical significance lies, and looking forward to the future to see what significance they might hold. All I can say is that I hope I inspired you to do the same thing with your family.